So I'm going to start today with a few large announcements. For those of you that have been thinking about some of what Professor Johnson talked about when he introduced OpenStreetMap, if you haven't, tonight, actually, from 7:15 to 9 p.m., is a GW Humanitarian Mapping Society Mapathon. And remember, no experience required. All you need to do is show up at the Zoom link. They usually have someone there to help train folks that haven't done it before, and it's a great way to get involved with projects that actually work towards some of the sustainable development goals that we've talked about. They're actually going to be doing some buildings in Indonesia that will help predict some disaster impacts for USAID, I believe. So anyway, just a reminder that for those of you that want to experience some of the actual workings of maps and learning how to map, the GW Humanitarian Mapping Society is a great way to get involved. It's all student run, and hopefully next year when we're back to the normal times, our mapathons will feature pizza. This time it will be virtual pizza. You'll have to order your own, but that's an opportunity for you tonight. And then I also wanted to introduce Dr. Declan Cullen. He's our major advisor for the geography department. And yes, I've posted all of those plus the Zoom links for the material that I'm covering right now. I posted that on Blackboard. So we have a geography department open house tonight, so you can come and learn a little bit more about the geography major. And I wanted to introduce Dr. Declan Cullen. He is our lead undergraduate advisor for geography. So Declan, take it away and just tell us a little bit about what the open house might entail.
Absolutely. Hey, good morning, everyone. It's nice to see like familiar names in the group, in the participants. Just on the mapathon, before I move on, I've been to mapathons and I can actually do them, and I'm not known for my technical skills or abilities. So it's very intuitive, let's put it that way. And so yeah, this week we have 4 separate geography department open house events. So we have 2 for geography. One we had on Monday, of which we had maybe 10 students. And we have another one tomorrow night tomorrow evening or afternoon, 3 to 5 p.m. I'd like to do it later, but I have a little toddler running around who doesn't allow me to engage with things after 6 p.m. And we also have environmental studies. So if you're interested in learning more about the geography major, if you've considered doing it, but you're not sure if you have the time to fit it into your schedule, if you want to know what classes look like, if you want to talk to other students who have done the geography major or are currently doing it, it will be a great place to come. So you can just click on the Zoom meeting. I'll be there for 2 hours. There will be, I guess, I can say there's virtual pizza because you have to order it yourself. So there'll be lots of virtual stuff. And hopefully we'll be back in Samson to do it in person soon. But any questions you might have about the major, classes, degree map, all the different complications, what you might do afterwards, jobs, internships, career paths, and all that fun stuff. I will be there for 2 hours, and I would be very happy to meet you and talk about geography with you, okay? And for environmental studies and our new BS in environmental sustainability sciences, there are also, let's see, what day is today? Tonight, April 7th from 5 to 6 p.m. Professor Keeley will be there, and I think Professor Allington. So there's a full schedule of geography, environmental study stuff for you to tune into if you want. And if you can't make it for some reason, you can always email me, Professor Cullen. You'll find my email on the geography website very easily, and we can set up an appointment to meet one-on-one if that is more convenient. Okay, so have fun. Actually, one thing about cats, if you're going to put up a fake computer, you might have to like heat it up a little bit, because what they really enjoy is the heat of the keyboard and being in your face, of course, because they're cats. But
this is true. Hey, Professor Cullen, will you tell us a little bit about some of the classes that you teach on a regular basis?
Absolutely, yeah, I should start with that. So I'm a human geographer like Professor Benton-Short, and I teach world regional geography, which I know a couple of you are in now. I teach political geography, economic geography, cultural geography, And I also teach the history of geographic thought, philosophy of geographic thought to our grad students, and a bunch of other kinds of things. So a broad kind of sweep of human, and I've also taught this class Intro to Human Geography on occasion too, which I really enjoy. The worst best class of all time. Thanks, Nicole. I can easily live with that. And Lauren's in cultural geography. That's right. I saw Evan earlier. He's in World Regional. So Leslie, my office hours are the same Zoom link that you see there. And they are from 10 to 12 on Wednesdays. Or by appointment. Again, I know you all have overlapping classes and so on, so I do make usually some available on Fridays as well, but also I'm generally meeting with students all the time at various windows in the day, okay? So reach out to me.
While I have you on here, why don't you tell some of the students what you're working on for your own research besides the team? What are you working on?
So I am involved in kind of 2 or 3 broad projects that are loosely connected. So I do a lot of work on kind of colonialism and economic development. So I've done a lot of work in Newfoundland in Canada, looking at its transition from a British dominion to a part of Canada and looking at kind of development policy there. I'm also involved in a research project with First Nations, with Indigenous people in Canada, looking at the kind of looking at land rights issues, but also at issues of economic development. And so I've been involved working on research projects in Nova Scotia with the Mi'kmaq First Nation. So those are 2 kind of projects I work on. And then there's a third one which I work on, which I got involved in Washington, D.C. with 2 friends, which is about Uber. And so we're very interested in looking at smart city technologies and how Uber and gig economy, platform capitalism kind of systems are changing the nature of work, are changing the nature of transportation, and are changing the nature of kind of how we think about and plan for cities. So we're in the process of doing our 4th or 5th year of kind of longitudinal work with drivers, so interviewing drivers over and over a 5-year period to see how they come in and out of the system. And also we're looking at well, my personal interest in it, given that I'm someone who does a lot of historical work, is futuristic. I'm interested in autonomous vehicles and how those systems are being developed and what they mean for cities. So yeah, we're working on a book proposal at the moment, and I've written a bunch of stuff on that. So if anyone's interested in any of those topics, please let me know. Those of you who know me and have been in my classes also know that I have an obsession with the Flat Earth Society. Professor Benton-Short knows that too. So I've been to some of their conferences in an effort to understand what is happening on the planet.
Why do they think the Earth is flat?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, listen, I don't want to take too much of your time, but thank you so much for popping in and just inviting everybody to join you at the open house tomorrow. Yeah. And also the Environmental Studies, which is a BA degree, and the Environmental and Sustainable Science class, which is a BS degree. That's tonight from 5 to 6 with Professor Melissa Keeley and Professor Ginger Allington. So, if you just want to find out a little bit more, I encourage you guys to go to these open houses, because you can talk to some of our current majors and get the real lowdown on some of these things. But also the lead advisors will be there to answer a lot of your questions. And I would say that, is this true, Professor Cullen, that about half of our geography majors are Elliott School first majors, right?
Yeah, generally about half, and a couple more since yesterday. So yeah, they do fit very well together. Your requirements overlap. There's a lot of overlap of interest, but also a different perspective and a different department. And so yeah, it's very, very common for those 2 things to fit together. In all kinds of ways. No matter what your concentration is in Elliott, there's always kind of a parallel interest in geography. So yeah, we have about half our students.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming, and
my pleasure.
I'll definitely post some information on our Blackboard page in terms of how to get in touch with you with the Zoom link for your office hours.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay. Have a nice day, everyone. Bye.
So I did want to spend just another couple of minutes before I get going on our day's topic, just to kind of, I had some students writing emails about what could you take next in geography in terms of classes, and I thought I would just run through what you might find on the schedule. So, you know, technically you're in the Intro to Human side. If you haven't taken the Introduction to Physical Geography, that's Geography 1002. This is considered one of your science or science with a lab requirements for Columbian College and for Elliott School. And that is the gateway course for most of our physical geography classes. You need that kind of grounding in some of the physical aspects of geography in order to take things like geomorphology and hazards, for example. But the courses that I have put the little red dots next to are courses that you can take because either they don't have any prerequisites, like Geography 1003, Society and Environment, or our Introduction to Cartography and GIS class, which is Geography 2104. Also, Professor Price, not Professor Cullen in the fall, but Professor Price will be teaching World Regional. That's also a class that doesn't have any prerequisites. And then moving down the line, the population geography class, if you enjoy just the little snippet of population, mortality, fertility, and some stuff on migration is actually in that class that Professor Ratcliffe teaches. That has a prerequisite of Geography 01, so you would be good to take that class. Biogeography is a great class. It's also a WID, but unfortunately you do need 01, you need 02, the Introduction to Physical Geography, so I did not put a red dot next to that. And then also the People, Land, and Food class 2133, that has no prerequisites, and that's a class that you can take. I should say that People, Land, and Food is a really popular class, so it does fill up quickly. I don't know if you'll get in the first time around, but we'll try and accommodate your interests. And Charlie, did you have a question?
I did. If you've taken both Intro to Human Geography and this class, what should we be taking next, that group of people?
Oh, okay. Well, if there was something in either one of these classes that you want to do a slightly deeper dive on, that would be a great thing to do. So, for example, if you took the Introduction to Physical Geography and you really liked learning more about climate, we are offering our climate class in the fall. Or if you were really interested more in kind of the idea of natural disasters and hazards, we're teaching a class called Geomorphology and Environmental Hazards, which is on the next page, and that's a class that you could take. If, for example, coming out of human geography, if you really enjoyed the economic unit, then definitely there's a couple of classes you could take, including our economic geography, but also we're launching a new class called Theories of Development, right? So when we were looking at things like the Rostow model, the neo-Marxian approach to understanding development, those will be like the entire semester. You get a deep dive in those. If you really enjoyed the population and you want to know a little bit more about population growth plus migration, that would be in the population class. Our food security class kind of follows up on our food security. And of course, one of the things I think that is a huge competitive advantage in the workplace is to have some GIS skills. They're increasingly in demand across every sector, private sector, government sector, nonprofit sector. Everybody wants somebody that can actually work with maps, take large sets of data and make something visual, especially maps, work with large data in general. So if you haven't had some stats class, I know it maybe not be like what you really want to take, but it's a great skill to have. And then some other classes I just want to bring your attention to. We have a great energy resources class, but that does require physical geography as well as water resources, and the hazards class. So those top three classes that up here that do not have a red dot, if you haven't had the Intro to Physical Geography, you're going to struggle to do well in that class because it just assumes you've got some of that background knowledge. Now, having said that, if you did take the AP Environmental Science class, you're probably okay to go ahead and take anything that would have required Introduction to Physical Geography. So we have Economic Geography up in the we've got economic geography, and that's Professor Cullen will teach that in the fall. We also have a class called Field Methods for Professor Keeley. That doesn't require any prerequisites either, and that's a class where you kind of learn how to do a variety of things that are outside in the field, like measuring water, the speed of water in a riverbed from tree canopies. We also have our regional classes, right? Because we also cover regions in geography. And so we have most of the world's regions covered as their own class. Our regional classes are interesting because our regional classes blend a little bit of human and a little bit of physical, right? So there's no prerequisites for our regional classes. So you could take geography of the Middle East, and North Africa, which Professor Attia is teaching in the fall, or geography of Latin America, which Professor Monk is teaching. And then do I have any other ones? And then rounding out, we have an environmental conservation class, a political ecology. So if you liked kind of some of the deeper dive around Marxian theories of development, political ecology really takes that kind of theory and develops it around people's relationship to the environment. And Professor Luthra does some really interesting work with the informal economy in India, and particularly looking at the livelihood of people who are kind of very poor and who are informal waste pickers and recyclers in India. And he comes at that with a political ecology approach. So that's a good theory class. We also have land use transportation. That's a great class that introduces you to kind of how planners begin to plan for transportation systems and other kinds of land use areas. And then if you're probably, and these 3,000 ones are probably more appropriate for rising juniors or seniors, because they tend to be pretty reading heavy with term papers. But again, if you're interested in agriculture and sustainability, Professor Kasanga is also teaching an agricultural and sustainable food systems class. And then lastly, Professor Streletsky is teaching another regional class called Geography of Russia and its Neighbors. So those are all classes that are offered for the fall, and you can check most of them out. Most of our faculty are pretty good at uploading the syllabus into Blackboard, so you can see at least what was taught previously. It's not always going to be the exact same class, but it gives you a sense of some of the topics covered. So I can answer many of your questions, and I'll stay on a little bit after class today if you have any questions about some of the specific kinds of classes that you could take. So that's kind of my introduction to what's going on this week, because I know many of you are starting to think about your fall schedule and what that might look like. Okay, now on to the meat of our topic for today, and that is to look at urban inequities. And I'm going to share with you and introduce some concepts around spatial racism, segregation, and gentrification. And in this particular lecture, we're building on some of what you did asynchronously last week, which was to kind of understand some of the basic urban trends that have been in place. And the idea here is that all cities are experiencing some levels of inequality. For example, in many cities in the Global South, the emergence of informal settlements or slums or shanty towns is a good example of those inequalities that we see play out spatially, right? So for geographers, the spatial aspect becomes a really important way that we can understand some of these consequences of urban growth. Today, what I want to do is focus more on the United States, kind of as an example of some of the challenges around urban inequality in the global north. And to share with you a little bit about what's going on, because if you haven't taken a look at assignment number 5, you're actually going to be looking at gentrification in Washington, D.C. So we're going to talk about some things at the broad scale, and then your assignment gives kind of a deeper dive into what's been happening in Washington, D.C. Around some of these concepts. So I'm going to start with the concept of spatial racism. It's one that geographers, in particular social and cultural geographers, have come to define as the patterns of metropolitan development in which some affluent whites creates racially and economically segregated suburbs or gentrified areas of cities, leaving the poor, mainly minority communities, African Americans, but increasingly also Hispanics and newly arrived immigrants, in isolated or more deteriorating areas of cities or older suburbs, right? So when we hear things like gentrification or segregation, they all have that spatial dimension to them, which makes them a real geographic topic to look at. It's something we can map. It's something that we can map over time to see the degree to which these things have changed or intensified. And that's where urban geographers have been spending a lot of time lately. One of the outcomes of spatial racism is just a level of persistent segregation in many US cities. It's hard to think of a US city that does not have levels of segregation. It also has led to concentrations of poverty. And these are because of long-term processes that when affluent people move out of the city and they leave behind low-income people, one of the consequences for cities is a declining tax base. When a city has a declining tax base, it starts to be unable to afford investments into roads, into infrastructure, into schools, and other kinds of publicly funded infrastructure and buildings. And that tends to accelerate the concentration of poverty as well. We also see fragmentation of government. So a lot of times suburbs and the counties where suburbs are located are not the same as the metropolitan or the municipal government, right? So you sometimes have fragmented government. So decisions are being made at a county level that maybe prioritize roads and infrastructure and new schools in the suburbs, but not in the cities, right? And we also see this play out in terms about rules about the use of space, both public space, kind of criminalizing, criminalizing the use of sidewalks and street space by people who are experiencing homeless would be an example of ways that cities have begun to criminalize things that they don't like. Or, if any of you have been to an indoor shopping mall, you know that even though that kind of gets used by the community, in fact, there's a lot of restrictions on how you can use space in an indoor mall. The food courts may seem to be kind of a big public space, but in fact, there are far more restrictions going on in an indoor mall than you might imagine. So in terms of historic spatial racism, this has been operating in US cities since we began to see urban growth, way back in the 17 and 1800s. But what I want to focus on for just the context for understanding some of what we see today, that we can actually visibly see in the landscape, these legacies that have led to segregation, we can really point back to some really particular policies and practices at the beginning of the 20th century. And one of the most enduring, having a very long-term impact, is a practice called redlining, which was really started in the 1930s. So let me define redlining for you. You've probably heard about this because of some of the conversations that have been coming because of the Black Lives Matter movement, talking about this long-term process of spatial racism and segregation. So if you haven't heard of redlining, it's a practice that is really about denying services by the federal or municipal government agencies or local governments, as well as the private sector, either directly or through the selective raising of prices. So what does that really mean? How did that really play out? So the important thing to understand is that this was really something that was widely practiced in many US cities and was legal at the time that this practice began in the 1930s. So one of the ways that this played out was a denial of financial services such as banking or insurance. We really saw it with the granting of mortgages for home ownership. So what banks would do is basically, decide what areas they felt were high risk areas, like, these are not areas in the city that we think there's a good chance people will pay back these loans in a timely way. And so essentially they would call those areas redlined. And if a family came in to apply for a mortgage in a bank and they gave their address for this mortgage they either wanted to buy, if this was a house or some form of residential housing that was within this redlined area, well, they could be denied getting a mortgage because they were considered to be high risk. But we also see this in terms of the private sector denying things like healthcare or supermarkets. So remember when we talked a little bit about food deserts, one of the lasting legacies of redlining is a lack of investment by grocery store chains into low-income communities and communities of color. And so we end up with, in the 2000s, areas that don't have these kinds of services. 70 years later, 80 years later, right? So I want you all to understand that this is a process that begins, but then it reinforces itself over the decades for many numerous complex reasons.
This is my thesis.
Oh, that's great, Nicole. We might have you share your thesis next time. So one of the things that results is just increasing inequity in the 1930s and 1940s as some places are deemed to be low risk and so receive investment from the city, from the private sector, where people do get those mortgages and other kinds of loans, and other places don't, right? And unfortunately, what this leaves us with is a real kind of growing division within U.S. cities. Neighborhoods with high proportions of minority residents were far more likely to be redlined, and I'll show you what that means, but redlined than other neighborhoods with similar household incomes, maybe even the same kind of housing age or housing type and other things, but had more white residents, right? So there was definitely a discriminatory practice that came out of assessing the level of risk. So you can Google redline and put in the city that's closest to you. You might find that some of these old maps have been scanned and are available. For a long time, these maps would hang in government offices or even in banks in the back rooms of a bank. And you can see that what you have here is a map, and if we read our legend, right, basically we have areas in blue, the lightest blue and the darkest blue considered to be the best areas, the desirable areas. These would receive the kinds of funding that we're talking about. Areas that were declining were kind of like iffy, like do we make a loan in these areas? And then the areas of kind of this red, because they would actually use red, that's why it was called redlining, became, the hazardous or high risk areas. And so, if you think about what we're looking at on this map, all of these areas that are redlined are going to be areas where people who are living here are going to find it very difficult to apply for any kind of bank loan, whether it's one to improve the house they own or whether it's one to try and own a house in these areas. We might also see that hospitals don't get built here and that schools are not not upgraded as much. So there's a whole variety of services that begin to disappear from these areas. And so we can call this kind of the process of disinvestment, right? Redline areas received less money, less investment because they were considered to be risky. And mostly these things were chosen sometimes on the condition of the housing stock and the infrastructure in that area, but a great deal of time simply based on race and income. So there was a report that came out about a couple of years ago that's from the director of Department of Housing and Urban Development, Sarah Pratt, and she wrote, and I thought it was really powerful, that here we have, you know, a federal agency that was in charge of backing mortgages and providing mortgage insurance, and so was definitely part of this redlining practice, you know, coming out and admitting that, you know, that this had been a practice that had resulted in increased inequities. So she wrote, like other forms of discrimination, the history of insurance redlining began in a conscious, overt racial discrimination practiced openly and with significant community support in communities throughout the country. There was documented overt discrimination in practices relating to residential housing, from the appraisal manuals which established an articulated policy of preferences based on race, religion, and national origin, to lending practices which only made loans available in certain in certain parts of town or to certain borrowers, to the decision-making process in loans and insurance, which allowed the insertion of discriminatory assessments into final decisions about either. So a really interesting article, if you want to read about it, we can. That's definitely in the slides, and we'll put the link also. So Evan, you asked, is there a good area of study for anyone interested in this issue as to how to look at redlined areas over gerrymandered districts? Actually, I bet there is a strong correlation there. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure if political geographers have looked at the redlined areas versus gerrymandered, but you know what happens is, you know, if we think about those maps of redlining, many of them were minority communities. Many of them are still minority communities in 2021, right? So chances are that also, as we get into our political unit and I talk about gerrymandering and some of the worst practices of gerrymandering, you know, it is carving out unfair districts based on political leanings, and you know, and oftentimes that also includes manipulating voting districts based on race as well. So I'll have to think about that, Evan, a little bit more, but yes, I'm sure there are geographers looking at that issue. So one of the consequences was that, you know, it became clear by the late 1960s that this practice was inequitable. And of course, in the late 1960s, this is also when we have the civil rights movement again, right? Starting with the 1964 March on Jobs for Washington here in DC under the leadership of Martin Luther King Jr. And so the 1968 Fair Housing Act actually banned racial discrimination in housing. But many people feel the legacy still endures, that you had almost 40 years of disinvestment in certain areas in the city, and that's not easily kind of compensated for very quickly. So, you know, we had definite lack of investment. Redlined areas lacked investment and continued to decline by the 1950s and 60s. So, you know, when you don't invest in infrastructure and it begins to crumble, when you don't invest in housing and it begins to fall apart, these communities then became targets for the next round of what I would think of as having a definite impact on spatial racism, which is urban renewal, right? So urban renewal was a planning process that began in the 1950s. It was led by a somewhat altruistic idea that we needed to demolish dilapidated old buildings because it would have been so expensive to have rehabilitated them, right? And so many housing areas in Washington, D.C., in New York City, in Chicago, some of those areas that have been redlined, I mean, when I talk about disinvestment, these were houses that didn't have running water. They maybe even didn't have electricity, may not have had heat. In fact, in many cities in the United States, if you rented an apartment up until the 1970s, there was no legal requirement for your landlord to provide heat in your apartment, right? And so if you imagine trying to put in those kinds of infrastructures in an older structure, many people felt it was cheaper to knock down these older buildings and rebuild new buildings from the ground up. So the other consequence was not only that these were areas that were targeted for destruction and demolition, but because redlining really resulted in African Americans and increasingly Hispanics not being approved for mortgages, even today, the percentage of home ownership among the Black population is significantly lower than the whites. So this has long-term consequences that seeps into today. I found this. This is a really interesting set of images. So basically what it is it's showing you the process of urban renewal overlaid on formerly redlined neighborhoods. So apparently you can zoom in using Zillow in their satellite view, and you can see old property lines that existed prior to when the freeways were put through. Now remember, I was just talking about urban renewal. One of the big emphasis in urban renewal was to build out and enhance urban infrastructure, and particularly highways. The 1960s is when we get the Highway Act too, right? So we're getting I-95 and 495 and 395 and other freeways being built. And how are you going to bring them into the city? Where are those connecting overpasses? Well, what happens is many of these redlined areas are demolished to make way for these big freeway systems. And that's what you're looking at in this map of Chicago. So you can see the ghost images of housing here directly under what would become a highway overpass. And you can see old housing buildings that were once neighborhoods. And so, you know, when we think about cities today, there's really a layer. It's like an onion. You can peel back layers and see kind of former areas. And so to be able to explain some of these changes over time is a particularly geographic perspective that geographers can bring. So, you know, again, the consequences of redlining are that a lot of today's current patterns of economic and racial segregation are still evident in many cities, from Montgomery, Alabama, to Flint, Michigan, to Denver, to Washington, D.C. And there's a really great series that came out in the Washington Post back in 2018 about redlining, you know, being more than 50 years old, but still having its impact today. And you can read that if you want to follow up on this discussion. There's also a short video that you can watch, and it really kind of shows you how redlining contributed to a growing racial wealth gap in the United States. And it also talks about why home ownership is an important goal for many people. Why is it important to have people owning homes as opposed to just renting? And one of the things that geographers have also been doing is taking a look at some of these formerly redlined areas, because once they were redlined, they were also demolished, and some of them were demolished and experienced urban renewal, but the redlined areas that weren't remained kind of highly segregated, predominantly minority and African American, and predominantly poor. And so geographers have also been studying what has been happening to some of these formerly redlined areas in terms of their effect of the urban heat island and the vulnerability of these people to climate change, which is increasing the urban heat island effect. So if you don't know about what the urban heat island is, you know, cities in general are several degrees warmer because we have far more concrete and asphalt and not as many trees and parks and green spaces as the suburbs. And so, you know, that's not such a bad thing during the winter, but during the heat of the summer, having a lot of those urban heat island effects can make cities 5, 7, 10 degrees warmer. And as we're seeing increased rising temperatures from climate change, these guys set out to see whether there was a disproportionate effect. And in fact, what they found, I underlined in red, that 94% of the areas studied displayed consistent city-scale patterns of elevated land surface temperatures in formerly redlined areas relative to their non-redline neighbors by as much as 7 degrees Celsius. So that means on a day where it's 94 degrees in an area that's affluent and has a lot of trees, in a neighborhood that doesn't have as many trees, doesn't have as good of infrastructure, you may be looking at something that's closer to like 101 degrees. And if you're looking at someone who's maybe on a fixed income or elderly and doesn't have air conditioning, that can really cause heat-related strokes and death. So I want to end up by talking about another concept that comes out of these inequitable practices, and that is gentrification. Many of you have probably heard the term gentrification, but I want to kind of make sure that we all have a good understanding of what that actually means and how it's playing out spatially. And gentrification is something that we see somewhat happening in global South cities, but to a greater degree, this has been a dynamic that has really been playing out in the global north, in cities in the global north, not just the US, but in Europe as well, mostly since the 1990s, because of some key urban processes that happened. And I'm just going to walk you through these key processes. So in the 1950s and 60s, many affluent whites began to leave the city for the suburbs for a variety of reasons. Some people wanted more space, and with the advent of the automobile and with the new freeways being built, people could live farther away from where they were working. So, but at the same time, there was the perception that as white, affluent, middle-class people began to move out of the cities, cities became even more dangerous because now we have low-income and minorities that are becoming more segregated and more concentrated. And so this is known as the period of white flight, where whites leave the city and go to the suburbs. And so they not only take themselves with them, they take all of their income with them, right? And they're taking their tax base with them. And this is known as a period of decentralization, and it lasts for almost 50 years. So, I know that you guys all know cities as being cool places, right? Because they're featured in things like How I Met Your Mother and Friends, and other kinds of, cultural, shows that kind of highlight how cool it is to live in cities. But, back in the 70s and 80s, most people did not want to live in the city. There was an attempt to exodus. But one of the things that kept, low-income people from moving to the suburbs was, one, the cost of the housing, but also there was a lot of discriminatory practices about giving mortgages to minority people, whether they were African American or Hispanic or newly arrived immigrants. It was almost impossible for them to get housing mortgages. There was actually restrictions on who you could sell your house to in the suburbs. And so that's another reason for the concentrated poverty that emerges in concentrated poverty and concentration of minorities in the city, right? So right around 1990, 2000, cities became cool again for a variety of reasons, mostly because some people were a little tired of the suburbs, that they felt more isolated, that you had to drive everywhere, and they were looking for other opportunities. Cities began to invest again in their cities to make them more attractive. Although starting in 2000, who's really moving to the city or who's staying in the city are the 20-somethings. Like, so your cohorts, right? People who have kids are still kind of going out to the suburbs when they have kids, with that kind of myth of, oh, I want my kids to run around in a big yard, and I want it to be safe for them, and I want them to go to the good schools, all of those things that have resulted because of inequitable investment, right? So one of the things that's happened in the last 20 years is that cities have become cool again, and they become cool for artists, they become cool for young people, and so cities are attracting those kinds of people back into the cities. We also see the global economic shift, right? So we see deindustrialization that kind of destabilizes a lot of economies. And so many cities have a need to rebuild, particularly old abandoned areas like waterfronts or factories. And so many cities have done so with cool things like brew pubs and luxury apartment buildings in an old factory with the old industrial exposed pipes, and so there's been a lot of shifting of the physical landscape as well. And so one of the things that's happened is middle class people are coming back to the city. They're bringing their incomes. They're looking for cool places. They want walkable urban landscapes. And all of this has led to revitalization and redevelopment, and in some cases, gentrification. Okay, so not all redevelopment is gentrification. Redevelopment is a natural process of changing the city landscape, right? And we see it in a lot of places. Buildings are old, maybe they get knocked down, things get redeveloped. Old areas are abandoned, they get built on, that's redevelopment. It can be gentrification, it's not necessarily gentrification. So let's figure out what gentrification really means. So many people refer to gentrification as the next kind of wave of spatial racism after redlining and after urban renewal. So gentrification is defined as the process of redevelopment and rebuilding that accompanies the influx of middle class or affluent people into deteriorating areas that often displaces poorer residents. Okay, so there's two processes at place. One is the physical change to the landscape. Buildings are being renovated or built brand new, right? So you're getting new things happening. 14th Street anytime lately, you will see construction happening, right? Physical landscape change. The second is a demographic shift, right? We get people of different race, but also different income who are coming into these neighborhoods. And gentrification implies some form of displacement, particularly of lower income residents. So in a sense, when you have the process of gentrification playing out, you're going to have a neighborhood that becomes whiter and wealthier, right? So that's two different processes that are two sides of the same coin, right? We've got a demographic change and we've got a physical built environment change. And this happens, one of the reasons why poor residents are displaced is because in many cases, poorer residents aren't homeowners, so they are renting. And oftentimes rental accommodations will either be sold to become redeveloped as condos or luxury apartments, or the rent may be raised because the property taxes are going up because the area is becoming more affluent. So for all those reasons, many poor residents who are renting find that they can no longer afford to live in that neighborhood. Right? Now, there could also be low-income residents that own their own homes in that neighborhood, and they may choose to sell their land. They may choose to sell their house because now their housing prices are going up, and it may allow them to maybe retire or move somewhere else and buy a bigger piece of property. So there can be a lot of demographic shift that can happen in a place that's being gentrified, right? It's really important that we understand that gentrification doesn't just happen in poor neighborhoods, but that's where we see it oftentimes the most dramatic. It could be very, very wealthy people replacing middle class people who can no longer afford that housing because it's gone up in value so much, right? And, places that have become almost ultra luxury become highly unaffordable to the people that live there. They may feel forced to leave because they can no longer afford to live there, right? So again, when we think about defining what does that mean, like what happens? Well, one of the things is we do get growing resentment, particularly around displacements. So whoever is being displaced is oftentimes not being voluntarily displaced. It's their neighborhood, it's their community. Maybe it's been a place that they have grown up in and lived in for 30 years. And now they can't afford there and they feel forced out. And you can imagine that is going to create some tension and resentment. Even those who remain, who are able to remain, may feel a sense of resentment because, you know, George's coffee shop where you could get a 25-cent cup of coffee has now been replaced by a Starbucks where you have to pay $3.25 for a grande latte, right? So sometimes it's also the services are changing, right? So when we think about redevelopment, oftentimes we might be thinking about kind of locally owned businesses that might be shifted because property values go up or the rentals go up, right? So, as an area becomes more affluent, it has a knock-on effect in businesses. And, a small family-owned business may find they cannot, they can't make a profit, but a Starbucks can, or a Whole Foods can. I know in my neighborhood in Navy Yard, which is an area that has gentrified, there was a McDonald's that was demolished about 2 years ago to make way for a luxury apartment. And on our listserv, there was a real mixed reaction. There was a lot of people going, yay, great, glad to see a McDonald's go. But then there were other people that were like, well, that was the only affordable place for me to get, hamburgers or French fries for my kids. So if you've been to Navy Yard, if you've walked around Navy Yard at all, there's no affordable food. I mean, it's all pretty upscale, right? I mean, there's a Sweetgreen and there's a Taquerian, and just about any meal you want is going to set you back $14, $15. And that's really going to be outside the affordability if you have 4 kids and your income's $25,000 a year, right? So losing services can also create tension in an area that's gentrifying. So I have a series of maps that show you some of this change over time. This is just going to show you demographic change because obviously it's a map that is showing you different races. So the blue are white, the green are black, the yellow are Hispanic, and the kind of reddish color dots are going to be Asian. And you can see in 1970, Washington, D.C. was really a black and white city. There was not a whole lot of international migration in Washington, D.C. That would change starting in the 1990s. But largely, in 1970, the District of Columbia was given the moniker Chocolate City because of its predominant black population. So just to give you a sense of direction, the yellow arrow that you're looking at is about 16th Street, right? So right there through the White House. On the east side, you can see that pretty much wards 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 are predominantly black, whereas wards 2, 3, kind of over there in, up on the west side of Rock Creek Park are all white, as are most of the suburbs. Now let's take a look at what happens by 1980. So we're starting to see some demographic shift, just a little bit here and there. We still see, majority black residents in Washington, D.C., but we also are starting to see a couple of other phenomena. We're starting to see maybe a little bit of urban change going on in here. Let me just change my color there. Let's see, we're starting to see a little bit of gentrification or urban redevelopment, demographic shift. And out here in the suburbs, we're beginning to see black population moving out into places like Marlborough and Prince George's County. So this is also an interesting thing. This is happening in Atlanta too. So areas with a large concentration of black populations are also starting to see the growth of black suburbs, which is interesting. But we also see that there is a dividing line, right? We don't see a whole lot of of Blacks moving into areas that had been predominantly white on the west side of the metropolitan area. By 1990, we're starting to see some noteworthy changes. We're starting to see some immigration, particularly from Chinese and Indian, also South Korean. We're starting to also see some Hispanic migration beginning to trickle into the district, mostly from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, not as much from Mexico. Here's 2000. So we can see that a lot of the district is starting to shift a little bit, both the metro areas becoming more diverse, but we're also starting to see the impacts of redevelopment. So now what you can really see in 2017, which is the last year they have the maps for, we have a lot more blue in this area, right? And we've got far more mixing of ethnicities here in the district. And then look out in the suburbs, lots more diversity, right? So this is kind of Wheaton. Out there's a large Central American immigrant population. This is this area is kind of where College Park is. Also has a very strong Hispanic population, immigrant population. So DC is shifting over time, definitely getting more diverse. But we can also see that one of the things that's happening is that within the district itself, white population is actually increasing starting in 2000, and Black population is actually decreasing. So there is a displacement going on in the District of Columbia, right? So thinking about all of the changes that come with gentrification, there's definitely some negatives, but there's also some positives. So let me just kind of talk through a couple of positive impacts. We see new investment, which can actually prevent a continuing decline of an area, right? You're getting investment back into an area that needs it, either physically to rehabilitate property or to bring back businesses. And so you may end up stabilizing that area. We're going to see property values rise, which is a good, not necessarily a good thing for the taxpayer, but it's a good thing for tax revenues for the city. It gives them more money to fix those potholes, to invest in schools. Unoccupied houses, houses that have been vacant, are considered dangerous, as we looked at kind of the whole vacant property in Detroit when we were looking at deindustrialization. Those are unsafe spaces that the city would prefer not to have vacant housing. So oftentimes gentrification will be, buying up vacant housing and redeveloping it or knocking it down and building new stuff. And you reduce those problematic spaces. We also see the visible physical rehabilitation of property. So one of the things that gentrification can bring, particularly in historic areas, is kind of, redeveloping that wonderful old Victorian and replicating some of the craftsmanship, right? So you actually can end up protecting historic buildings by rehabilitating them. And if you watch any of the design shows, a lot of them, there's several of them that focus on bringing the old houses back to life by, replacing the broken windows and fixing, the gingerbread scroll that has been missing from the banisters, right? And so cities also gain revenue not only from taxes on residences, but also new businesses. So those are really some of the positive impacts of gentrification. But increasingly, geographers, among others, sociologists and anthropologists, are also people that have looked at gentrification. There are negative impacts. And when it's not controlled well by the city, when affordable housing is not insured, when there has been a long-term lack of investment into communities, it is possible that you end up with negative impacts. So, for example, as gentrification accelerates, rent prices are going to increase, and it's possible that the original inhabitants of the area are not going to be able to afford those rents, particularly if there's not good policies in place around acceptable rent prices per year, right? Like rent rules and rent laws. Displaced individuals could become homeless, and that can lead to a host of health issues for them. We also see resentment emerging in the community, and conflict can occur between the original inhabitants and the new gentrifiers, right? As many of these images are showing you, some people actually organize to fight and resist what they see as this undesirable change happening in their community and in their city. Affordable housing in the area may become scarce, particularly if we're leaving this all to the private market. You know, one of the reasons why we might see displacement and the lack of affordable housing is because, let's say you had an apartment, like a former townhouse that had 3 apartments, right? And one person buys that and converts that to a family home. So you have 3 apartments that now go down to 1 home. Right, so the total housing stock can also shift and leave many people without housing. And then you're also maybe converting, you know, what is affordable housing at the moment, you might lose that to luxury condos or to the private market. And I can tell you, for example, here in the Navy Yard, townhouses are going for about $1 million, and a 2-bedroom apartment here in Navy Yard will run you about $3,500 a month for 2 bedrooms, right? I mean, that's just not affordable by the median income for DC. The type of local services can alter and their prices can increase, right? So think, you know, no McDonald's and having to buy all your food at Whole Foods, or whole paycheck, as some people call it. But also the negative impacts can be from, you know, initially in the early phases of gentrification, we may see more diversity as we have a mixed community living with each other. But over time, if gentrification accelerates and there's no protection for affordable housing and other kinds of things that will keep some of the original residents there, then you're going to see the demographic shift, right? And it's going to become almost all affluent. Maybe it'll become mostly white, displacing people of color, right? So I thought I would just kind of end up by noting that when we think about some of the Sustainable Development Goals, some of them are related to the notion of urban equality and moving towards a more fair urban planning process, more fair urban outcomes, right? And I just picked out a couple of them. For like example, reduced inequalities from SDG 10 to empower and promote social, economic, and political inclusion of everyone. To 10.3, ensure equal opportunity and reduce inequalities of outcome, including discriminatory laws, policies, and practices. And then in SDG 11, which focuses on sustainable cities, to enhance inclusive and sustainable urbanization and capacity for participatory, integrated, and sustainable human settlement planning and management in all countries. You know, the challenge of urban redevelopment for US cities is, how do you balance the need for redevelopment, particularly in areas that have endured long-term disinvestment, right? It's needed. At the same time, how do you balance that with making sure that you're not destroying communities that have existed there, that you're not displacing people, and that you're creating opportunities for everyone to enjoy redevelopment and revitalization. And most cities are not getting that right now. Most cities don't have what they need in place to prevent the negatives from gentrification outweighing some of the positives. So I'm going to stop there. I'm not going to send you to breakouts this time, because I want to just kind of link to assignment number 5, right? So for assignment number 5, what you're going to do on your own time, it's about a 28-minute film, and it's called There Goes the Neighborhood. and it focuses on gentrification and signs of gentrification in Washington, D.C. And it focuses on two areas. It looks at what happened with the Shaw area, the U Street corridor, which has been a really interesting transformation and a worrisome one for many Blacks in Washington, D.C., because U Street has historically been the Black Broadway of Washington, D.C. It's been a long-term cultural center, and yet it has also seen tremendous gentrification. So up and down 14th Street, as well as U Street, there's been a lot of pressure and a lot of redevelopment and displacement going on. And then even more recently, interesting changes are happening across the river in Anacostia. So there's just a set of questions that accompany the film. And so assignment number 5 should not take you more than an hour and a half to 2 hours at the most to do, but it is due tomorrow at 11 p.m. And it'll just reinforce some of those ideas that we've talked about today. So I'm going to stop and take any questions that anybody might have. Well, it looks like some of you guys don't have any questions. That's okay. I'm gonna go ahead and end class.